All right. Faith in Jesus said, love your teachings. Thank you from your Exodus series. Can you explain more about the demons going into the pigs, how that was to show Pharaoh's army? I never heard your explanation before, and it blew my mind. Well, the basic thing that I've said, and I guess you're asking me to expand on it, but the basic thing, for the sake of everyone, that I pointed out that Mark's gospel is actually incredibly profound. A lot of people think of it as unimpressive as far as the gospels go. You know, you hear people say John's their favorite, Matthew, maybe Luke. John's usually everybody's favorite. The more I've studied each gospel, the more I've been like, oh, I don't know. It might depend on the day of the week. I might love John more and Matthew more and Luke more and Mark more because they're all so incredible. But one of the things Mark is doing is he's showing that the Exodus was the paradigm for what God was going to do to redeem the world. So you have this temporal act of deliverance from the land of the dead, where God takes them out of Egypt, universally, known in the ancient world as the land of the dead. You know, the Pharaoh even had on his headdress a serpent, right? So here you got the land of the dead ruled over by this individual. He's got a serpent on his forehead, and God delivers them through the waters of the Red Sea. That becomes for the Israelites the prototypical example of salvation, so that when the prophets come along and they're talking about the future redemption, the eternal redemption that God's going to accomplish, not simply from their slavery, their physical captivity in Egypt, but from sin, death, the grave, Satan, everything, the whole kit and caboodle, they draw their language from the Exodus. So if you look at the opening section of Isaiah 40, so 1 through 39 in Isaiah is considered the first section of his book. Chapter 40 through 66 begins the next major section, where he's suddenly turning to the hope, the consolation that God promises to the people who have been exiled and judged and everything else. And it begins with God saying, a voice, or with the prophet saying, a voice crying out in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord. That language, wilderness, harkens back to the Exodus, when they're brought out of Egypt into the wilderness. And so you have, it's basically saying there's a new Exodus coming. And all throughout these chapters, you have resonances, things that refer back to the Exodus. And what is it all talking about? Well, ultimately, it's talking about the coming of the Messiah. There's some other things sprinkled in there, but this is its ultimate end that it's pointing to. And so when you pick up Mark's gospel, right at the beginning, the threshold of the book, Mark says, Arche tu euangeliu. He's just trying to remember the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, and so forth. He begins by quoting this new Exodus section from Isaiah, and then he also merges it with the prophecy of Malachi and Malachi 3:1. Which, by the way, refers to the Messiah as the Melech HaBarit, the messenger of the covenant, the angel of the covenant. It says he's coming to his own temple. Well, so Mark opens up this way, and he identifies John as the one preparing the way for Jesus. John's out in the wilderness baptizing. Here comes Jesus. He's going to lead this new Exodus, right? This ultimate salvation, deliverance. And so when you go through Mark's gospel with this in mind, it's incredible. In Mark chapter 4, Jesus rescues his disciples from the raging sea, right? He says to the sea, be muzzled. He uses the very term that's used for when Jesus silences the demons. Just like he muzzled the demons and told them to be quiet, he muzzled the sea, and it was still. In the Psalms, it repeatedly says that God rebukes the sea, he muzzles the sea, he says to it, be quiet, be still, and so forth. So Jesus comes acting just like God in the Old Testament. Immediately after delivering his disciples from the sea, he comes upon the Gerasene demoniac. And when he asks, what's your name? The answer is Legion, because, we are many, right? There are many demons in him. The word Legion is a term for a military unit, right? So just like Pharaoh and his armies pursued Israel, God rescued them through the sea. And then what did God do? God closed the sea on Pharaoh and his legions, drowning them in the sea. What does Jesus do in the case after he delivers the disciples from the sea, showing himself to be Jehovah? He encounters a legion of demons. And what does he do? He casts them out into the pigs, and they rush down the embankment into the sea where they're drowned, just like Pharaoh and his legion, right? That's followed in chapter 6 with Jesus feeding a multitude of Israelites in the wilderness. Again, this is the Exodus. Deliverance from the sea, destruction of evil forces in the sea, into the wilderness, feeding the multitude of Israelites. And then Jesus recapitulates it all, right? He does it again. In chapter 6, he once again delivers the disciples from the sea. In Mark 6, he delivers a girl from a demon, one of Satan's troops. And then in chapter 8, he again feeds a multitude in the wilderness. Now, you have then a miracle of feeding twice. Once happens in Jewish territory, once in Gentile territory, indicating the salvation of both Jew and Gentile. And then, to top it all off, after Jesus feeds the multitude of people again, they go up the mountain of transfiguration where Jesus is glorified. And who appears atop the mountain? Moses and Elijah, right? You go back to the Old Testament after the Exodus, through the sea, into the wilderness, the feeding. What do? They go to Mount Sinai. They go up the mountain. Who goes up the mountain? Moses, right? Goes with 3 others. So does Jesus, right? Peter, James, and John. I mean, it's all Exodus. It's all Exodus stuff reenacted. So, I mean, it's incredible stuff. So, here's the basic point that I would drive at with that. What Jesus is doing by recapitulating these events is he's showing people he is the Lord of the Exodus. He's demonstrating to them by doing not just any old signs, but those very signs that identify them as a people, the signs by which God rescued Israel and took them to himself and made them his covenant people. Jesus is saying, that's who I am. But the true new Exodus was what he was about to do. These are just small-scale reenactments of what happened in the past. Because if you look at Luke's version of the Transfiguration, when Moses and Elijah, by the way, both Moses and Elijah saw the Lord atop Mount Sinai. So here they are on the Mount of Transfiguration, and Jesus' glory shines, and Moses and Elijah see him there, and so do the disciples. Had to be like deja vu, right? They're like, hey, we've done this before, right? Anyways, so when they're talking in Luke, when he gives the account of the Transfiguration, it tells us what they were talking about. It says they were talking about his departure, his upcoming departure at Jerusalem. The literal Greek word is exodus. They were talking to Jesus about his coming exodus. So the exodus is Jesus passing through death, the baptismal waters of death, right? Remember how Jesus speaks of his death? In Mark 10, the disciples are, they're fighting who gets the best spot next to Jesus in heaven. And then Jesus says to them, can you be baptized with the baptism with which I'm going to be baptized? He's referring to his coming crucifixion, when the cup of divine wrath would be poured out upon him. And through that, he would rescue his people from sin, from death, from Satan, all the rest. So it's pointing to Christ being crucified, buried in the tomb, and risen again from the dead. And there's a lot more that could be said about that. But so that's the basic point, that Jesus is showing that this is who I am. So when I go to the cross, you guys don't be sitting over there thinking, as they were, how could this be happening? How's he dying on the cross? This doesn't make any sense. This is the way of salvation. This is the way of redemption through the blood of the paschal lamb, right? Oh, I forgot to mention that, didn't I? Before Israel was taken out of Egypt, they had to slay the firstborn. They had to slay the paschal lamb. That's who Jesus is. He's the paschal lamb. Through his death, the Exodus is accomplished. So that's what I would say is the point of all that.